On July 21st of this year, the op-ed section of the New York Times did something unprecedented. That day, the weekend edition of the Times published 8 articles by 8 of their opinion writers, and all the headlines began the same way. I was wrong about. The topics the columnists had been wrong about ranged from Mitt Romney to protests to Trump voters. And each column described how the journalist had once written a piece they now believed to be wrong. For the newspaper of record, this was a powerful and counterintuitive editorial choice. In an industry that depends on accuracy for credibility, it was especially powerful. From the New Yorker to the Washington Post, journalists and public intellectuals are under more pressure than ever before in history to be right about facts and opinions the first time. And in the internet age, when new information arrives every second and cancel culture runs rampant, the pressure is even more pronounced. These days, even a single misreported fact or thoughtless comment can destabilize an entire newspaper and throw a paper's existence into question. Which is why I want to share with you what the editorial board of the New York Times said at the beginning of the July 21st section. In our age of hyperpartisanship and polarization, when social media echo chambers incentivize digging in and doubling down, it's not easy to admit you got something wrong. But here at Times Opinion, we still hold on to the idea that good faith intellectual debate is possible, that we should all be able to rethink our positions on issues, from the most serious to the most trivial. It's not necessarily easy for Times opinion columnists to engage in public self-reproach, but we hope that in doing so, they can be models of how valuable it can be to admit when you get things wrong. Or in brief, we live in a culture where admitting we were wrong is harder than ever before. And you know what another word for admitting you were wrong is? Humility. And what is Yom Kippur about? Humility. And this is what's extraordinary about the editorials. They were examples of extremely public, very personal humility. Many of the writers had maligned or vilified a public figure, and so making an about face of this kind was a very, very public act of apology. And this is why Yom Kippur is so difficult. Yes, fasting is tough, but Yom Kippur's real challenge isn't the hunger pangs or the day away from the siren song of our electronics and work. Its real challenge is in admitting that we were wrong, that we messed up, we hurt others, and that despite our best efforts, we're still, a year after last Yom Kippur, imperfect. The pain of these 24 hours is in the insistence on humility, the insult to our egos, and the threats to our identity or our sense of self. Because sometimes we hold on to being right because we truly believe that we are right. But other times, and we've all been there, we can't step away from our sense of rightness because the stakes of admitting that we were wrong are so very high. Mike Brooks, a psychologist who has studied humility and change, explains, admitting we're wrong is difficult because human beings attach our sense of self to an idea, a cause, or a group. When we feel that that idea about the self or identity is threatened, our evolutionarily linked fight, flight, or freeze survival mechanism becomes activated. We defend against being wrong, and we fight to be right. That is, our very sense of and construction of ourselves as individuals depends on our identification with our ideologies, with our opinions, and with our grudges. To admit that we were wrong is both a threat to and an abdication of that self. And the deeper our commitment is, whether it's a political stance, an opinion about another person, or an ideology, the harder it feels to let it go and admit that we were wrong. The genius of Judaism is that it knows how difficult this is, and that clinging to our certitude, even when it harms us, is human. Because of that, being moved from certitude or a sense of self-righteousness doesn't just require will. It requires a community which honors and makes space for humility and vulnerability. And the sense that not only are we not alone in our stubbornness and self-righteousness, but that there is a way out of both. Yom Kippur is that way out. It gives us the structure and the public space to admit our mistakes, a formula for how to confess, a community to do it with, and perhaps most importantly, it honors our doing so. To quote Maimonides in Mishnah Torah Tshuva, chapter 1, verse 1, when a person shall commit any sin that people commit, and that person is guilty, then they shall confess their sin which they have done. This means confess in words. How does one confess? One says, I have sinned, I have acted wrongly, I have transgressed, and I repent and am ashamed of my deeds and will never do this again. The more one elaborates and the more detailed the confession one makes, the more they are praiseworthy. It might seem like using Maimonides' formula and naming our mistakes and our screw-ups in public makes it more painful to acknowledge our imperfections. And perhaps at first it does. But in the end, it's far easier to express humility and apology in a room with hundreds of other people and be reminded that even the best of us have made mistakes, unintentionally or intentionally hurt other people, and missed the mark. By praying and confessing together today, we're reminded that screwing up is human, and that naming our mistakes is the first step in becoming the people we aspire to be. It is also opening the door to change. And here's the thing. If we don't screw up, we also don't grow. To quote Episcopal priest Barbara Brown Taylor, sin is our only hope, because the recognition that something is wrong is the first step towards setting it right. That is, rather than seeing Yom Kippur's humility as emphasizing our faults, we can see the opportunity to admit we were wrong as optimistic, even liberating. Because who you are now and who you have been is not the limit of who you might become. That is, Yom Kippur's true message is freedom. We are not stuck in who we are or what we did. We can start over and give ourselves the gift of a fresh start. But there's more. The confession that we were wrong is only the first part, because most of us would rather say, I'm sorry, than do the actual work of changing. To quote Reverend Taylor again, to paraphrase a parable of Brother Kierkegaard's, if you put a bunch of people in a lobby and give them two doors to choose between, one that says transformation and another that says lecture on transformation, then most of them are going to line up for the lecture. And yet Judaism insists on transformation, and transformation begins with humility. In fact, the Kabbalists, the Jewish mystics, believed that the very first act of humility in the universe began with God, who, in order to create the world, had to change. The story goes like this. In the beginning, God's energy filled up the whole of the universe. Everything that existed was pure divine energy. God was everything and filled up everything. But God was lonely. So God realized that for anything or anyone else to exist, God would have to recede into God's self to make room for light and dark, water and dry land, plants and animals, and finally, humans. And so in the most powerful act of humility in history, God did what the Kabbalists called Tzimtzum, and God contracted into God's self so that there would be empty space in the universe. Only then could the universe be filled with all the wonders of creation. God, in other words, had to transform God's self for the world to exist. The humility didn't end with God. Moses, the greatest of our leaders, is described as being extraordinarily humble and receding at key moments. In Numbers chapter 12, verse 3, we are told, "Now Moses was very humble, more so than any other human being on earth." Why was Moses so humble? Well, first, he kills an Egyptian taskmaster who had been beating an Israelite slave. As a result, he's forced to give up his life in the Pharaoh's palace, a life of riches and power, to flee into the desert with only the clothes on his back. Once there, he knows he can never go home to his old life, and he resigns himself to being a lowly shepherd. He gets married, and then, just when he's married Zipporah and is becoming comfortable with the quiet life, God appears out of a burning bush and informs him that he has to give everything up again to lead the Israelites out of slavery and into freedom. Moses' response? He protests. "You have the wrong guy. Choose someone else. I am not right for this job. I stutter, and I'm just a shepherd." And when God exists, Moses acquiesces, taking on a position of power and responsibility he doesn't want and doesn't feel qualified for. In the doing, his life becomes one of the greatest stories of all time, and one he could never have imagined. A story. In my third year of rabbinical school, I had to take an introductory Talmud class. The study of Talmud, if you don't know, is notoriously difficult, particularly if you didn't grow up steeped in Jewish texts. But at the time, I was lucky because I was the Reform rabbinic intern at NYU. And there was an Orthodox rabbinic intern at NYU working with me. Many of you know who he is. His name is Yonah Hain, and he was one of the rabbis at my installation. Well, when Yonah discovered that I was struggling with Talmud, he offered to be my chavruta for the rest of the semester. That is my study buddy for my Talmud class. Despite the fact that he was a rabbinical student at Yeshiva University at the time, in their most elite kollel, or program for their most promising rabbinical students, he was willing to, once a week, sometimes more, sit down with me and study texts he had learned when he was in elementary school. We would be study partners, he assured me. I agreed, knowing that it was far more likely that he would be the teacher and I would be the student. Yonah, it's important to note, had started studying the Talmud when he was in kindergarten, which means that at 30 years old, I was learning texts that my Orthodox friend had learned at 5 years old, and struggling mightily with them. Now, lest you think that Yonah's humility and willingness to work with me was impressive, it wasn't just Yonah. See, through Yonah, I also met one of his oldest friends, Akiva Block. Akiva was also a rabbinical student at Yeshiva University, and we became friends too. And Akiva also offered to be my chavruta, or study partner, for another rabbinic literature the following semester. That class was called Codes and was about halakha, or Jewish law. And then, in my final year of rabbinical school, I went on an American Jewish World Service trip to Senegal. And while I was there, I met another classmate of Yonah and Akiva's, Noah Greenfield, another name that may sound familiar to you because he's taught Talmud here at GRS and also came to my installation. In any case, Noah was also in their kollel, or small class of exceptional rabbinical students at Yeshiva University. And when we came back from Senegal, Noah offered to be my chavruta partner to study another rabbinic text, Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. Each of these men had been studying these texts since they were small children. I, on the other hand, had been studying them for at most a few weeks. And all three of them were in an incredibly rigorous rabbinic program and working part-time. And yet they were willing to sit with me as a chavruta, a study partner, for hours at a time and relearn texts they knew like the back of their hands. Because they're kind, yes, but also because they are profoundly intellectually curious, and they believed they might learn something from studying these texts with a female Reform rabbinical student who knew almost nothing. Even now, their humility and their openness takes my breath away. To think of how quickly, how selflessly, and how even enthusiastically Yonah, Akiva, and Noah offered to learn with me. Given their status at Yeshiva University and the depth of their learning, they had every right to be arrogant, even dismissive of me. And yet they were the opposite. So did they learn anything from me? I really don't know. Akiva and I argued a lot. Yonah did a lot of encouraging while I repeatedly complained that I didn't get it and verged on tears. And Noah, he is one of my dearest friends. So why did they do it? There's a beautiful line in the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, chapter 1, verse 2, which says, "Make for yourself a teacher, acquire for yourself a friend, and judge every person favorably." But what does this mean? Make for yourself a teacher and acquire for yourself a friend. The Maharal, a medieval rabbinic commentator, explains it this way. Make for yourself a teacher means that a person should learn from all people. Therefore, the Maharal explains, each person you meet can become your teacher, since you can learn from each person. That is the meaning of make for yourself a teacher. Make each one into someone you can learn from. The word make is important here because it doesn't say get yourself a teacher or find yourself a teacher. It says aseh, make yourself a teacher. That is, with enough humility, we can make anyone into a teacher. We can learn from anyone and anything. 3 chapters in Pirkei Avot, another rabbi, Ben Zoma, asks, who is wise? The one who learns from everyone. The irony of all of this is that when I was in divinity school and rabbinical school, I developed a very annoying habit of self-righteousness. Such self-righteousness seems to be an occupational hazard for many rabbis, and it's taken me quite a few years to chill out, although I am not fully there. In any case, it was a spectacularly unattractive quality, exacerbated only by having spent a few years at Harvard before rabbinical school, and despite being surrounded by the humility of my Orthodox friends. I spent a lot of time lecturing Yonah, Akiva, and Noah about feminism. And I spent a lot of time pontificating to my friends who were corporate lawyers and on Wall Street about doing good. It took a lot of humbling experiences to mellow me out. Now imagine this. That was me being wrong about myself. Can you imagine how wrong I have been about other people? Or the cost of each one of us in this room being wrong about many of the people we've come across, or ideas we've committed to? Because as seductive as moral surety can be, it also carries risks. That we will lose out on relationships, on experiences or ideas because we're too stuck in our own heads and perspectives. But there is an alternative, humility. And today on Yom Kippur, no matter how stubborn we may be, we get to show up as humble people, admit we were wrong, and promise to keep trying. And we gain something from this type of public humility. We learn that the world does not end and we are not diminished if we choose to admit our mistakes. We learn that revising what we thought we knew opens doors and possibilities we might never have imagined, even and especially when it feels like the stakes of doing so are incredibly high. Yonah, Akiva, and Noah knew this instinctively. And here's the thing, despite the fact that I studied with all 3 men for months at a time and built deep and meaningful friendships with them that continue to this day, they are all still observant Jews. And Akiva and Yonah lead their own Orthodox communities. And while they may have had their perspectives altered by our friendship and our time together, they also didn't become less of themselves through our studying together or learning about Reform Judaism. They're still the people we were when we began. As for me, I still struggle with Talmud study, and I'm as much a feminist as I was in rabbinical school. But I also have a deep respect for orthodoxy that I could never have imagined before my friendships with those men. and a profound honor for the depth of their knowledge and how seriously they take their religious, their spiritual, and their ethical lives. And I believe that it is just that knowledge and seriousness that allowed them to offer me the deep respect and curiosity despite our differences. And so my blessing for all of us this Yom Kippur is this. This year, may we continue to show up as our most humble and curious selves, not just today, but every day. May we allow ourselves to imagine that we have something to learn from the least likely of sources. May we get comfortable with the discomfort of being proven wrong and not feel shame when and if we are. And may our openness to learning we can change our minds be the doorway to a richer and more joyful life. Gamar Chatima Tova, may you be sealed for a good, a healthy, and a sweet year in the book of life.